Shalom and welcome back to the Messiah Yeshua. I'm glad you're here to learn the Word of God with us. Today we're diving into this week's portion, which is Ki Tetze. We'll explore its wisdom, its beauty, and we'll see how it speaks to our lives right now. Together we'll look at passages from Deuteronomy 21:10 through 25:19, which will connect us to Isaiah 54:1 through 10, as well as Matthew 24:29 through 42. And we'll start with the Torah portion summary. As Moses stands beside the banks of Jordan River across from Jericho, he reiterates the commandments of the Torah for the new generation. Ki Tetze contains more than 70 of the traditional enumeration of the 613 commandments. A woman captured in a battle cannot be raped. A firstborn son receives the birthright, even when the firstborn of the second wife is favored. The wicked and the rebellious son is liable to stoning. Lost livestock are returned to their owners, and a corpse is not left exposed overnight. A mother bird is chased away before young are taken, and a parapet must be built around the roof. Certain mixtures of seed are forbidden in the same field, and animals should not be interbred. Marriage and sexual conduct feature prominently. Prostitution and fornication are prohibited. A man who divorces his wife cannot remarry her after she has remarried. A man is not to wear garments ordinarily worn by a woman, nor is a woman to wear garments ordinarily worn by a man. A husband is not to be pressed into military service or other mandatory service that would separate him from his new bride for 1 year. Usury is forbidden, but it is permissible to require a pledge of collateral. One who requires a pledge of a poor person must allow the owner to use it when he has a need of it. We are to afford special care to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, and it is forbidden to return escaped slaves to their owners. An escaped slave who takes refuge in Israel is given citizenship and the right to live in the place he chooses. The parsha concludes with the laws of the levirate marriage and the commandment to remember to blot out the memory of the Amalekites from under the heaven. And we'll go a little bit deeper into Ki Tetze. The 49th reading from the Torah is called Ki Tetze, which means when you go. It is named after the first words of Deuteronomy 21:10, which are when you go out to battle against your enemies. Deuteronomy is organized as an ancient Near Eastern covenant treaty document. Previous chapters of Deuteronomy formed a preamble and a historical prologue, and general covenant stipulations. Chapter 12 began a section of more specific stipulations, and this portion continues with the Code of Laws. The laws of the Torah are more than just a legislation. They are covenant expectations that provide us with God's directions for living life. This Torah portion contains more commandments than space will allow us to study, including the commandments governing warfare, marriage, divorce, child raising, paternity, and a host of other issues. So we will select a few commandments on which to focus while demonstrating that the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 3:19. So let's dive into something that's called love and war. When you go out to battle against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take them away captive and see among the captives a beautiful woman and have a desire for her and would take her as a wife for yourself. Deuteronomy 21:10-11. A popular English maxim states, all's fair in love and war. The implication is that rules of proper conduct can be suspended when fighting on the field of battle and when playing on the field of romance. The Torah disagrees, however. According to the Torah, not everything is fair in love or war. The previous Torah portion spelled out certain laws of conduct for warfare, and this Torah portion introduces the prospect of romance on the battlefield. A soldier in a heathen army would have no compunction over taking, raping, and disposing of a captive woman. Not so in the army of the Lord. The Torah acknowledges that the soldiers of the conquering army are likely to be tempted to take the captive woman, but it forbids acting on the impulse. Instead, the Torah demands that a captive woman be granted dignity and honor. She is to be allowed to mourn her parents. She is to be given the honor of marriage. She is not to be taken forcibly. She is to be married and given the status of a wife. She cannot be treated as a slave, nor can she be sold. And before the conquering soldier can consummate his desire and marry the woman, he has to allow her to mourn the loss of her family for a full month. During this period of time, she is to shave the hair of her head, and according to Rashi's reading of the Hebrews, let her fingernails grow. Shaving the head and letting the fingernails grow long are apparently mourning rituals of the time. However, Rashi suggests another reason for her hairless, unkempt appearance. He states that the Torah's laws are attempting to dissuade the man from marrying the captive woman by making her appear repulsive to him. And that is right. That is the correct reason. The month of mourning is like 30-day waiting period during which the man has time to reconsider his intentions. Does he really want to marry the weeping bald woman with the long fingernails? If at the end of the 30 days the man has decided he is not pleased with her and does not want to marry the woman after all, he is to let her go free. And usually we have to also remember, in these examples, usually those soldiers were already married. So they had a wife that was waiting for them at home. They went on this battlefield, and then they came back with another woman that they captured. They said, honey, surprise, I'm home, and we've got a second wife now. So the Torah is exactly wanting to dissuade the soldier from this second marriage. We also are going to see that the soldier is required to change her garment and put her into something that's called more modest garment, because the women that were in that city used to dress very immodest to kind of seduce the soldiers. So to take that out, the woman needs to wear a regular garment with modesty and let her hair grow and her nails grow long, as we just read. And the Torah's wisdom in this matter teaches us several principles that apply to every romantic relationship. A person should never rush into marriage. Love at first sight is not real love. Before committing to marriage, a person needs to take time to see past the other person's sexual allure. A man needs to see through the fog of lust. And that is exactly why in the Jewish world we have something that's called shomer negum, which basically means we don't touch a woman until we're married. Because when you hold hands, which leads to kissing, which leads to other stuff, it is very deceptive. And basically those feelings can grow and cloud your judgment. But when you refrain from touching the person until you're married, you're literally marrying them for who you are. You like them, you love them, you fall in love with them. And when you're married, then it's like the beauty of marriage that lets you to touch the woman's hand, kiss, and so on. And it's something that's called charm is deceptive, and the beauty is fleeting. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. We see that in Proverbs 31:30. So these laws teach us to curb our natural desires and remember that the person we are so attracted to is, after all, another human being, not a sex object. Furthermore, the laws pertaining to the captured woman teach us that sex before marriage is never sanctioned. I wish the people in our generation understood that more. Even the battlefield soldier had to delay gratification 30 days and wait until the wedding document was signed. And we'll talk about children. Obey your parents. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them. Deuteronomy 21:18. So kids will be kids, and that's true. But they don't have to be bad kids. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. We also see that in Ephesians 6:1. The Apostle Paul said that And in the Bible, obeying one's parents is a very big deal, so much so that a rebellious and disobedient son was supposed to be stoned to death. Did the ancient Israelites really stone their rebellious children to death? The Talmud states there never has been a case of a stubborn and rebellious son brought to trial, and there never will be. And then we read that from B. Sanhedrin 71a. So I wouldn't say there has never been a case. There's been many cases, but they just haven't brought him to the trial because of the parents' love for their children. And nevertheless, the law is fair warning to all parents. Some parents look the other way when their children disobey and misbehave. The Torah wants us to realize that permissive parenting is not an option for the people of God. Many parents today tolerate disobedience and regard teenage rebellion as an ordinary part of growing up. It may be ordinary, but that does not make it permissible. The Didach says, do not withhold your hand from your son or daughter, but teach them the fear of God from their youth. And that's Didach 4:9. And the book of Proverbs says that a man who does not discipline his son hates his son, but a man who loves his son disciplines him diligently. Discipline teaches a child wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. We also see that in Proverbs 29:15. So another proverb states that disciplining a child will not kill him, but warns that withholding discipline could both kill him and doom his soul to hell. We see this in Proverbs 23:13-14. It says, do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die. You shall strike him with the rod and rescue his soul from the Sheol. Parents are responsible for bringing up their children in a godly manner. If we do not, our children will inevitably pay the consequences, whether in this world or in the world to come. So while serving in the northern Minnesota, this is a story of our friend. His father was a pastor, and he had a next-door neighbor, a godly Christian man who had 3 sons. When each boy was born, the men prayed over the child, saying, if this child will not grow up to follow Jesus, be saved, and receive eternal life, I ask you to take his life while he's still young and innocent. The men valued the immortal soul of his children more than their health or longevity. One day while the boys were young, they were sitting together under an oak tree when the tree was struck by a bolt of lightning. All 3 sons perished in the innocence of their childhood. The neighbor told our friend's father that no matter how it grieved him to lose his sons, he still preferred that they died young rather than growing up to serve the devil. Wow, what a story. And his father was inspired by this story. Him and his mother decided to commit their children to the Lord in the same way. It wasn't easy, his father said, especially knowing that the story that had inspired us to do so. We prayed for 3 days before we could come to the point of unreservedly relinquishing their beloved children freely into God's hands. But when they had gotten victory over themselves, they made the commitment. It turned out not to cost them what their neighbor's commitment cost him, but they sincerely meant it when they did the vow. And their father once told them that it is his greatest joy in his life that all of his children were believers and serving the Lord. And so may it be for all of us. We'll talk about David's rebellious sons. The commandment of stoning a rebellious teenager seems unreasonably harsh, but the story of David's sons illustrates that a parent who does not discipline a child is actually taking the child's life. King David did not fulfill the responsibility of training his children. David loved his sons too much to properly discipline them while they were growing up, or so it seems. The proverb says, "He who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently." Proverbs 13:24, as we read, right? So as a result of a permissive parenting, several of David's sons met the tragic and grisly ends. His son Amnon raped his stepsister Tamar. David did nothing about it. David's son Absalom, which was Tamar's brother, murdered Amnon in vengeance for the rape. David did not properly deal with Absalom's vigilante action. He merely exiled him temporarily. Absalom then led a rebellion against David and was eventually speared by David's men. David's son Adoniah attempted to usurp the throne. Solomon had him struck down with the sword for his rebellion. And the Bible says that David never crossed his sons at any time. He never asked them, "Why have you done so?" And that's in 1 Kings 1:6. So in other words, he never held them accountable for their behavior. Had David disciplined his sons when they were young, rebuking misbehavior and punishing disobedience, he might have saved their lives. And what is lost and found? You shall not see your countryman's ox or his sheep straying away, and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly bring them back to your countrymen. Deuteronomy 22:1. According to the popular proverb of childhood, a person who finds an object has the right to keep it. We call it finders keepers, or losers weepers. The adage, and it goes on. The Torah sees things differently. According to the Torah, we have an obligation to return a lost object to its owner. The Torah says that if you see your fellow's livestock straying, you aren't allowed to ignore the wayward animals. You have to return them to their owner. A person might be tempted to keep something he found, but if there is any way finding the owner and returning the object, the person must do so. This is a part of being a people of integrity, a people worthy of God's name. This is a part of loving others. If I lost my wallet, I would hope that the person who found it would return it to me, right? Treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the Torah and the prophets, and we see that in Matthew 7:12. Sometimes commandments like this can get you into trouble. A teenage orphan boy in Uganda was studying Torah at the Acts for Messiah mission. He had just learned the commandment of returning a straying animal when he saw a cow that had pulled free from its leash and was wandering away. Eager to fulfill the commandment, the boy hurried to catch the cow and tie it back down. A stranger saw him, assumed the boy was stealing the cow, and attacked him with a club. The poor boy barely escaped with his life. Livestock can be tricky. Once when a friend of ours, Michael, and him were on the road to some teaching event in Texas, they turned to another person and asked, "Do goats bite?" "Why do you ask?" the person replied. And Michael had seen a baby goat trapped outside of its pasture between the highway and a fence, desperately trying to get back inside the pasture. He immediately thought of the commandment of returning the lost livestock. We stopped, and then they turned around and returned the goat. As they emerged from their vehicle, we realized that this was not a cute little baby goat, but an adult billy goat. And one of their crew tried to lure the goat with the peanut butter crackers. Instead, the goat fled up the fence line. A young man with them ran to head the goat off. Feeling trapped, the goat turned to run across the highway. So they watched it in terror as the goat dodged a semi-truck. At that point, they all agreed that it was not a good deed to get the goat killed. They were just getting ready to leave when the police showed up. And when they sent one of their staff members to try to explain that they were not goat stealers, the police officers joined their effort to rescue the goat. She turned on her lights and siren to try to frighten the goat into leaping back over the fence. Instead, the goat leaped across the highway in front of oncoming traffic and went running down the other side of the highway. So Michael and our friend agreed that their work was finished. Their last glimpse of the goat was through the rearview mirror, in which they could still see the goat leaping alongside the highway with the police car, sirens, and lights, still in hot pursuit. I will talk about an interesting story from the Talmud. If your countryman is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it home to your house, and it shall remain with you until your countryman looks for it. Then you shall restore it to him. Deuteronomy 22:2. It once happened that a man was traveling through the land of Israel. He was carrying a lot of things, including a small cage with a few hens inside. He stopped to rest near the house of Kanina ben Dosa. But when he got up and left, he inadvertently left the cage behind. Later in the day, the wife of Kanina ben Dosa came outside and she discovered the cage with the hens inside. She was delighted. She and her saintly husband were very poor. She assumed that God had blessed him with a gift, and she looked forward to the supply of fresh eggs. The hens would provide for them. When Kanina ben Dosa found out about the hens, he forbade his wife from taking their eggs. The Torah commands us to return these hens to their owner, he said. He built a small chicken coop. The eggs hatched, and soon there were more chickens. This went on for some time until his yard was filled with multiplying chickens. Kanina ben Dosa was troubled by the chickens, so he sold them all and used the proceeds to purchase goats. Over time, he soon had a small flock of goats, but he refused to allow them to be slaughtered. They do not belong to us, he insisted. One day, the man who lost the hens was traveling through the area again. As he was passing by Kanina ben Dosa's home, the man remarked to his companion, "Several years ago, I accidentally left some hens here." Kanina ben Dosa overheard the remark and asked the man, "Can you describe the hens you lost?" And the man replied that he could. And he described the hens in detail. Satisfied that he had found the rightful owner, Kanina ben Dosa said, "I no longer have your hens, but here are your goats." None of your business. You shall not see your countryman's donkey or his ox fallen down on the way, and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly help him to raise them up. Deuteronomy 22:4. So conventional wisdom tells us to mind our own business. That's a good policy. Nobody likes a nosy person who pries into one's personal affairs, right? But the mind of your own business, adage, can be misused as an excuse to not help others. The Torah says that if you see a person's donkey or ox fallen under its load, you shouldn't just ignore it. You should stop and help the person stand his animals back up. That requires the tedious job of untying the animal's load, standing the animal up, and then helping the owner reload the beast and tie the freight onto its back again. It would be easier to just pass by on the basis that it's not your business. But according to the Torah, when somebody needs help, it is your business. The Torah is not just concerned about animals. The principle of assistance applies to almost any practical need a person might have. Throughout your day, you may have dozens of opportunities to fulfill this commandment. Everything from opening a door for someone whose arms are loaded with packages, to stopping to help someone change a flat tire, or agreeing to take someone's shift at work so they can be home with a sick child. The list of possibilities is really endless. We really can make a business out of being kind and helpful to people. The basic concept is to step outside of your own self-absorption long enough to see and meet the needs of others. If we constantly apply the principle of assistance, people will notice. It's hard not to be impressed by a person who's always attentive to needs and generous with his time and efforts. The business of committing these random acts of kindness is a good way to get to know others and teach them about the gospel and the love of God. Dressing the part. It says, "A woman shall not wear men's clothing, nor shall a man put on a woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." Deuteronomy 22:5. They say you can't judge a book by its cover. But if that's the case, it's only because the book had a lousy cover designer. The truth is, the way we dress impacts people's perceptions of us and, by extension, their perception of God. As children of God, we have a responsibility to dress decently and respectfully. This can be compared to a king who had a son who liked to dress like a pauper. The young prince saw no shame in dressing that way. He even felt that it was a mark of his humility to do so. One day his father said to him, "When you dress as you do, you shame me, my house, and our whole nation. Why should the people say, 'Behold, the king's son is in rags'?" The idea that God cares about how we dress goes against the grain of today's culture. Our popular culture prizes freedom of expression above notions of decency and propriety. I mean, people just literally almost dress naked these days. Children under the sway of the world find it difficult to accept the idea that the Bible has the right to tell us how to dress. The people of God, however, are called to be separate from today's culture. We should not be wearing immodest clothing that flaunts sexuality. A daughter of God should not be dressed like a prostitute, advertising her wares. Neither should she be dressed like a boy, nor should a boy be dressed like a girl. They say that clothes makes the man. Modern society seems to have taken that concept a step farther, using clothing to make a man out of woman and a woman out of man. The Torah says that cross-dressing is an abomination. So it doesn't say it's wrong or sinful. It's higher and higher. God calls it's an abomination. And it's an abomination to the Lord, and it is categorically forbidden. The Bible sees transvestism as deviant and very sinful. Most believers might agree, but a great many of us are nonetheless keeping pace with the latest fashions and fads, even when those fashions and fads bend the gender line. This is the reason most Torah communities discourage women from wearing the customary talit, prayer shawl, from wearing tzitzit in the same manner as men, and from wearing tefillin. By adopting ritual accessories that have been traditionally associated only with men, women are crossing the Jewish gender lines. The Hebrew of Deuteronomy 22:5 says that a woman shall not wear a man's implements or garment. The Targum Pseudo-Yonatan, an early Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah, renders the passage as follows. He says, "Neither fringed robes, which is talit or talit katan, nor tefillin, which are the ornaments of man, shall be upon a woman. Neither shall a man shave himself so as to appear like a woman, for everyone who does so is an abomination before the Lord thy God." Deuteronomy 22:5. The least of the commandments. You shall certainly let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, in order that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days. Deuteronomy 22:6-7. Don't make mountains out of molehills. Means don't turn a trivial matter into a large concern. Yeshua seems to espouse a similar sentiment when he chastises the religious for scrupulously observing the small details of God's law while ignoring the weightier provisions of the Torah. And that's in Matthew 23:23. Nevertheless, Yeshua taught his disciples to keep even the smallest of the Torah's commandments. This is very important, so hear this. He said, "Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments," which is what all the Pharisees were doing, like they were keeping every single little commandment, but to a very big, cloudy religious level. So he said, "Whoever then annuls one of these least commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5:19. So have you ever wondered what is the least of these commandments is? According to the Talmud, one of the least of the commandments is the admonition of Deuteronomy 22:6-7 to drive away a wild bird from her nest before taking her young. So for people who mistranslate that Yeshua canceled the Torah and we don't need to keep any of these commandments, he says in Matthew 5:19 that even the least one of them you need to keep. And in the famous work of The Guide to the Perplexed by Maimonides, which is Rambam, he explains that the commandment to drive the wild mother bird away before taking the young from the nest is an act of mercy. It would pain the mother bird to see her offspring taken. By driving her away before taking her young, we reduce her suffering. If God so cares for the emotional pain of a simple bird, how much more so should we show compassion to all of his creatures, especially our fellow man? If Maimonides is correct, the law of driving away the wild bird is a commandment to show mercy and kindness to all God's creatures, to exercise compassion and empathy, and to do our best to alleviate the suffering and emotional pain of others. In that case, it's not a small commandment at all. Instead, it belongs to a category of laws that Yeshua called weightier provisions of the Torah. And that's also in Matthew 23:23. And we'll talk about something that people called unequally yoked. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Deuteronomy 22:10. Popular proverbial lore about love and marriage says opposites attract, right? Marriage counselors who have the unpleasant job of trying to reconcile polarized marriages disagree. So does the Bible. The Torah says that the Jews are not to plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. It says that the Jewish people are not to plant a field with two different types of seed. It says that Jews aren't to make a garment out of the two different types of linen and wool knit together. Each of these commandments illustrates an important principle about relationships. In 2 Corinthians 6, Paul interprets the prohibition on yoking two different types of animals together metaphorically as a prohibition against partnering with an unbeliever. It says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Messiah with Belial? Or what has the believer in common with the unbeliever? Or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. 2 Corinthians 6:14-16. The world says that a person should marry whoever he or she falls in love with. That is a very bad plan. It is possible to fall in love with the wrong person. If you allow yourself to be emotionally invested in a person, marriage is likely to happen. A person should be extremely reluctant to marry someone who is not of the same religious persuasion. So Christians must not consider marriage to someone who is not a believer and follower of Yeshua. To do so would be unevenly yoked. A true disciple of Yeshua should not even consider marrying a marginal believer, somewhere in the middle. A story from our friend, he says that he knew a girl from a Messianic home who went away to a Christian college. While in school, she fell in love with a student from another school, but she told him that she could not marry him unless he was a believer. He immediately assured her that he was a believer and was eager to learn more about her faith. This was the answer she wanted to hear, so she looked past his shallow religious life and married him. As soon as they were married, he lost all interest in the matters of faith and resumed his secular pursuits. The girl found herself unequally yoked in a home that would never be spiritually functional. What if a person is already married when he or she becomes a believer? Paul tells us to remain in a marriage so long as the unbelieving spouse is willing to remain. Yet, if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases. 1 Corinthians 7:15. And another very big topic that we're going to discuss a little bit, sex outside of the marriage. If this charge is true, that the girl was not found a virgin, Deuteronomy 22:20. The secular culture says, if it feels good, do it. The Torah has a different perspective. The Torah says, if it is good, do it. If it isn't good, don't do it. God wants us to understand that not everything that feels good is good. When it comes to sex, the Bible has some old-fashioned ideas. For example, the Torah teaches that people should not have sex until they are married. The Torah expects a new couple to be virgins on their wedding day. In Bible times, if a husband discovered that his bride was not a virgin on their wedding night, he was to turn her over to the court. If the court could consistently prove that she had not been a virgin at the time of marriage, though she had claimed to be, they put her to death for the sin of disgracing her father's home by engaging in fornication while under his authority. So in this example, it's actually it more applies to that they thought she cheated on her husband. Because back then, the marriage had two parts. One was you got engaged, and then sometimes even a year later, you would get married. So when this happened, when people get engaged and a year later they got married, this is where this concern was coming from. That in that specific year, the person thought that the woman must have cheated on him, and therefore, if she did, it was a death penalty. But she could have not been a virgin before their marriage or engagement. In that case, she was clear. So on the other hand, if it could be proven that she was a virgin and the bridegroom's allegation against her was false, he was punished by the court. In addition, he had to pay a heavy fine to his new fathers-in-law for maligning his honor. And these ideas seem foreign to the common person today. In the modern world, there is no expectation that the bride and groom at the wedding are virgins. In fact, there's a little expectation that the typical teenager is a virgin. But the people of God are not the people of today's world, and our teenagers are not to be the typical teenagers of the world. Carry a shovel. You shall have a spade among your tools, and it shall be when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it, and shall turn to cover up your excrement. Deuteronomy 23:13. You may have heard of burying the hatchet. The Torah tells us to carry something like a hatchet and to use it to bury other things. God was in the midst of the army of Israel. Therefore, the encampment of Israel took on a holy status. The army of Israel was to maintain a high standard of ritual fitness within their camp. A ritually unfit person had to stay outside of the encampment. Moreover, the Torah said soldiers in Israel's army were required to carry an implement with them for the purposes of digging a latrine. The camp of Israel was to be both sanitary and ritually fit. King Saul almost lost his life for ignoring this commandment. Once, when he was out with the army of Israel, he felt the need to relieve himself. Rather than to dig a hole outside the camp, he thought for a place where, it has a little bit more privacy that might befit his royal person. He entered a cave to carry out his business. Unaware that David and his men were hiding farther back in the cave, while occupied with the matter at hand, King Saul had his back to David, and David crept up undetected behind Saul. David could have killed him, but he was unwilling to be responsible for killing the king of Israel. Instead, he cut one of the fringes of the corner of Saul's garment to retain as evidence that he had spared the king's life. If Saul had obeyed the commandment of carrying a shovel, going outside the camp, and digging a little hole in the ground, he could have avoided the entire embarrassing incident. The commandment to carry a shovel and cover your own mess has ready application to lots of areas of life. No one is perfect. We all make mistakes and bad decisions from time to time. Even a godly person makes a mess. of things every so often. The question is, once you have made a mess of things, what will you do with it? Do you leave the mess for someone else to step in and deal with? Or do you take the responsibility, attend it to yourself, and bury the matter appropriately? Grounds for divorce. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. Deuteronomy 24:1. When our, I guess we can say, grandparents said, "For better or worse, till death do us part," they meant it and made it work. The reality today is very different, as you guys know. Divorce is common in both religious and secular homes. What made our grandparents different? Why were they able to keep their vows? Grandma and grandpa were not a better match, nor were they more happily married. Their marriage suffered the same weaknesses and character flaws that characterize marital problems today. The primary difference between their generation and ours in regard to marriage is that they did not regard divorce to be a viable option. Divorce carried a social stigma. It was a religious taboo. When divorce is not an option, a couple usually finds a way to cope and make the marriage work. Is divorce an option for believers? The Torah does allow for divorce. The Torah says that if a man marries a woman and then finds some indecency in her, Deuteronomy 24:1, he may write her certificate of divorce. This implies that if he does not find some indecency in her, he may not divorce her. What is the meaning of some indecency? For what reason does the Torah allow a man to divorce his wife? In the days of the Master, there were different opinions about what the Torah meant by the words of some indecency. Some teachers of the Torah claim that it might refer to anything a husband found displeasing in his wife. If he found her to be a bad cook, or even if he found her unattractive, he had grounds to divorce her. Other teachers of the Torah took a more conservative view. They taught that some indecency referred to sexual indiscretion or some type of breach in chastity short of legal adultery. Adultery is not in view since it carried a death penalty, not the threat of divorce. So Yeshua sided with the conservative view. He disallowed divorce except for the reason of sexual immorality, and we see that in Matthew 5:31. He explained that the only reason the Torah allows for divorce at all is hardness of heart, Matthew 19:8. Hardness of heart is a biblical idiom that refers to a refusal to repent. Hardness of heart can be seen in a spouse guilty of sexual immorality or inappropriate behavior who refuses to stop. Hardness of heart might also be seen in a spouse who refuses to forgive his or her partner when he or she does genuinely repent. Thus, the Master teaches that immodest, immoral sexual behavior does constitute legitimate grounds for divorce. There are other legitimate reasons for which a wife may want to divorce her husband, such as physical abuse or substance abuse, but the Torah and the Gospels do not address the criteria on which a woman may divorce her husband. Yeshua does make one thing clear, however. Divorce is never to be permitted when it is done for the reasons of marrying another person. According to Yeshua, if a man divorces his wife because he has picked out someone else he wants for a wife, his second marriage is adulterous. So too if a woman divorces from her husband so that she will be free to marry another man with whom she has fallen in love, the second marriage is adulterous because the first marriage did not end on legitimate grounds for divorce. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife without legitimate grounds and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband without legitimate grounds and marries another man, she is committing adultery." And that's in Mark 10:11 through 12. Yeshua sets the standard for marriage very high. In his view, the divorce is an option only in extreme cases such as sexual indiscretion. When his disciples heard this, they were dismayed and said, "If the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry." Matthew 19:10. What they meant was that if a person enters marriage with a mindset that if things don't work out, divorce and remarriage will be an option available to them in the future. So it would be better for the person not to get married at all. And the disciples were right. If a person wants to have a Torah marriage in accordance with the words of Yeshua, he should resolve with his fiancé prior to the marriage that divorce will never be an option. It should not even be a word in the vocabulary of their relationship. A person already married should have the same conversation with his spouse. And both husband and wife should commit to hold to the standard of "for better or worse, till death do us apart." Compassion and righteousness. It will be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 24:13. So it may be a ruthless dog-eat-dog world, but according to the Torah, we are to look out for those who occupy economic and social stations beneath us, not devour them. God tells us to nurture special concern for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. He tells us to protect the vulnerable and champion the right of the poor and oppressed. We are to deal fairly with the disadvantaged, and we are prohibited from making harsh financial demands on them, insisting on immediate payment, or seizing collateral from them. The Torah says that we should let the poor glean in our fields, groves, and vineyards. To the extent that we extend such charitable gestures toward the poor and underprivileged, the Torah says it will be righteousness, tzedakah, for you before the Lord your God. In Judaism, the word tzedakah, righteousness, is a synonymous word with charity. The laws of the Torah are meant to instill godly character in us. Godly character is exemplified in things like paying one's employees fairly and promptly. A shrewd businessman would forestall paying his employees as long as possible so he could use the money to work toward greater profit. It is an act of tzedakah to pay his employee as promptly as possible. Godly character is exemplified in the way a person treats his animals. The Torah says that a person is not to muzzle an ox while it is shredding out the grain. The agricultural practice of having an ox shred out grain is a method of threshing. The thrumping hooves of the ox separate the grain from the husk, readying it for the winnowing. The shrewd farmer would muzzle the ox so that it would not eat the grain it was shredding out. It's just good business sense. You wouldn't want your ox eating your profits, but imagine the hungry ox forced to walk over a delicious grain all day long, unable to open his mouth to eat. For animal, it would be a Tantalus-styled or torture befitting the imagination of Dante. The Torah teaches us to practice empathy even for the brute beast. How much more so should we nurture the concern for our fellow man? This Torah portion is rich in commandments that will make us better and godlier people if we actually study them, learn them, and do them. By virtue of His laws, God builds virtue in His people. And that's about it for today, guys. A very good parsha, lots to think about and to learn and to do different in our world. Thank you so much for watching. If this message did bless you, please like the video and subscribe. It helps the message to reach more people who need encouragement and truth. And feel free to follow our Instagram, linked in the comments, for daily inspiration as well as daily prayers. May God bless you and keep you. May He shine His light on you and be gracious to you, and may He turn towards you and grant you peace. Grace and shalom to you all.